Chapter 281, Detoxification. Scylla's gaze regained focus as those memories returned to him. An eye and a pinecone. Those are both ancient depictions of olden Egypt and their empire. But Scylla closed his eyes and his visualization seemed to thrum with life. He returned to that day in his memories as though that very same pinboard was sitting right before him. This time, he didn't just pull the strings horizontally, but also upward as well. Because this was only a memory and not real life, he was able to force the strings to stay in place, and suddenly, the eye and the pinecone became a very recognizable shape. It was a bit blurry, and the edges weren't very defined considering these were the pathways inside the structure and not the structure itself. But Scylla's was still certain. It was a pyramid. The mountain of Giza. Was it referring to a pyramid? What Scylla's didn't know was that during the era of the sixth summoning, there was a pyramid known as the Pyramid of Giza. However, with the collapse of governments as they were previously known, and with the attempt to wipe away all previous cultures and force Earth into a state of oneness and unity, such history was not passed down. At least not in such detail. If Scylla's had known this, he would have realized what these things were referring to. Unfortunately, he had not the slightest clue. The only reason he recognized the Ujit eye and the pinecone, which symbolized the tree of life, was because at least some lingering parts of this story remained. After all, Scylla did know that the United Coalition of Terra Nova was once the United States of America, so there were some things about the old order that he did know. But this only made him more confused. Why was Legacy so obsessed with it? Scylla's eyes narrowed. It seemed that he would have to find the truth out in the future. Only this way would he be able to settle this down. They used him to further their ends. In that case, they shouldn't blame him for taking advantage of them as well. Back then, he was only 9 years old and while he was intelligent, he didn't have the maturity to match it. Now, he wasn't so easy to take advantage of. However, he could do nothing in his current state. Let's go, Scylla's weakly called out to the Basilisk King. He tried to summon the dire wolf, but his expression sank when he failed. Mount less than dire wolf, F, is in critical condition. Cannot be summoned. It wasn't long before Scylla's realized that this wasn't because it was injured, but because he hadn't fed it. There were two ways to feed mounts. The first was with ether, and the second was with real food. Scylla's had been out for too many days and hadn't done his duty. Though this world had a lot of video game mechanics, it most definitely wasn't a video game. Every now and then, this world would give him a rude awakening that made that as clear as day. In the end, Scylla's had no choice but to try and circulate his ether, only to feel like thousands of knives were cutting him up. Scylla's let out a gasp of pain and collapsed back onto the ground. Cold sweat covered him from head to toe and he realized now that he might have underestimated just how bad his situation was. Until now, he had been avoiding looking at his rewards because this wasn't the best situation to accept them. He was still in danger, and from what he could collect from the Basilisk King's memories, it had been forced to move his unconscious body several times already. Honestly speaking, Scylla's wasn't very worried about Alex exposing him. But that didn't mean that others couldn't find him. Scylla's grit his teeth and decided to rely on the madness key. Maybe it could help him. How do you cure yourself of elixir poison? Elixir toxicosis is a chronic disease that most will have to deal with their entire lives. When Scylla's read this first part, he felt like his heart hit rock bottom. Even if he went back now, he knew that there was no other choice but to do what he had done. But was this really it for him? In this state, he couldn't even exhibit 10% of his stats, and he couldn't even circulate his ether without feeling as though needles were piercing into his inner organs. Scylla shook his head and forced himself to read the rest. This was unlike him, and it unfortunately has very few ways to deal with it. The first method is to find a detoxification elixir with 100% effectiveness, the second is to complete an evolution into the next grade and evolve your species. The third is to have a higher life form purge your impurities with their higher grade ether, the fourth is to undergo a metamorphosis. Scylla stopped reading, his brows furrowing. How was this classified as few methods? However, he realized now that although there were many methods on this list, almost all of them required exceptional circumstances. Most couldn't just break through before they felt like it, and considering Scylla's had yet to even see an elixir that was 60% pure, there was no way he was going to find one with 100% purity, let alone of this particular type. Under normal circumstances, Silas would be out of luck. Not only did he have no chance of finding such an elixir, but he was nowhere near evolving, and there shouldn't be a higher life form on Earth unless one of those aliens had snuck in. That wasn't impossible, but why would they help him? Especially after he was pretty sure that he had killed one of their own. But when it came to undergoing a metamorphosis, he was pretty sure he had a method. He had completed his class quest 6 times over. He had killed 5 level 10 elites, plus the level 12 Arctic Emperor Cobra on top of that. It seemed that it was about time he look at his rewards. Chapter 282, Steel. Path of the Mancer, Fragmented Quest. You have displayed a tenacious will and a sharp intent for battle, but you are missing the final piece to your power. Following the path of another is easy, following your own is much more difficult. The word Mancer has a storied history, deeper than you know. There are many complex definitions, but it can be boiled down to a single word: control. Open up the path of the Mancer or die trying. Fragmented reward requirements. Greater than kill a level 10 creature with the path of the Mancer. Quest: Path of the Mancer, fragmented, completed. Clearance level: fragmented. Rewards: greater than fragmented Mancer class. Silas wasn't surprised to see this notification. This was what he was hunting the Arctic King Cobra for in the first place. What did surprise him, though, was that he saw not just one clearance notification, but 6 of them. He was confused at first until he realized something. He hadn't just killed one level 10, he had killed 5 of them plus a level 12 that was of dubious origins. He still hadn't forgotten the oddity of the level 12 Arctic Emperor Cobra's grade. There had just been a dashed line, which was peculiar considering it was usually question marks. Question marks were what appeared when he couldn't read the grade of an existence, but this time, that wasn't the case. Of course, Silas had known that he had completed the requirements of this quest several times over, but usually you could only clear a quest one time. So when he had noted that he had done so, it was only perfunctorily. But it seemed the system didn't feel that it was so perfunctory after all. Looking at the list of rewards, Silas realized that this quest was like this so that he wouldn't be locked into one creature should he accidentally kill one that he wasn't a fan of. It gave him a wide array of choices. Essentially, he could kill as many level 10 Mancer creatures as he wanted, and he would receive the same chance to use them as a foundation for his class. In fact, they even let him preview his rewards before he picked them. In the end, Silas just started off with the first. Arctic Guardian, fragmented. The tundra is your calling and poison is your wine. Stoic as the endless white plain, and timeless as its bedrock of ice, nothing gets by you. Plus 30 Constitution. Plus 30 Intelligence. Stat limit increase, plus 10 per level. Free stats, plus 5 per level. Class modifier, 0.1 Constitution, 0.1 Intelligence. Silas read through it carefully. It seemed like a defensive class mostly. Would they all be the same? Dash. Arctic Reaper, fragmented. The tundra is your calling and poison is your wine. Unavoidable as the endless white plain, and timeless as its bedrock of ice, your blade strikes true. Plus 15 Strength. Plus 15 Dexterity. Plus 30 Intelligence. Stat limit increase, plus 10 per level. Free stats, plus 5 per level. Class modifier, 0.05 Strength, 0.05 Dexterity, 0.1 Intelligence. Are these classes all based on their skills? It seems so. This Arctic Reaper class might be related to their scythe skill, and the first one is more in line with the nature of these creatures. They're definitely more defensive in type, but I can't really tell if one class is better or not like this. On the one hand, it's probably better to have more modifiers. But on the other, being a jack of all is probably not a good thing. The only reason Silas' stats were all pretty much equal now, at least in terms of his physical, was because he was precisely that, a jack of all. However, classes obviously help people to specialize. A modifier was a special tag given to a class that would allow certain stats to grow faster than others. A 0.1 modifier meant that with both of these classes, Silas' intelligence would grow 10% faster than any of his other stats. Meaning, when he leveled up and gained plus 10 to his stat limits, intelligence would gain plus 11 every time instead. This was the same for free stats as well. The other 3 class descriptions were pretty much the same. They all emphasized intelligence, as the Arctic king cobras were more mage-like than not. Though that made sense considering they were mances. That was the entire point of his chain quest. There was only one left. Dash. Arctic elite fragmented. The tundra is your domain and poison adorns your chalice. Plus 30 wisdom. Plus 30 charisma. Plus 30 intelligence. Stat limit increase, plus 10 per level. Free stats, plus 5 per level. Class modifier, 0.1 wisdom, 0.1 charisma, 0.1 intelligence. Scylla's gaze flickered when he saw this. This was no doubt the Arctic Emperor Cobra's doing. Even though it was also a fragmented class, it was clearly on another level compared to the others. Even the best class among the first few only gave plus 70 stats at best, but this one gave plus 90. At the same time, it had a modifier for 3 stats instead of just 2. And there was no drop in percentage like there was with the others. The answer seemed very obvious. Even though some of the others were interesting, and he wanted to have improvements to his physical as well, this was the only path he could take. Plus, there would be opportunities in the future to upgrade the class further, presumably. Even if he was stuck on the path of the Arctic Royal now, that wasn't so bad either. His battle style still heavily relied on his mental regardless. He was very lucky this time. If he didn't take down 6 of these beasts at once, he would have never known that there were multiple opportunities to be had. He would have to keep that in mind in the future. Just as Scylla was about to accept this reward, his fingers stopped. He felt an odd emotion, but he was used to it by now. It was his luck again. When he checked his notifications once more, he was happy that he listened to it. You have killed a beast in the process of evolving. Would you like to steal their destiny? Chapter 283, Determined. Scylla's eyes narrowed. Was this related to the dash he had seen by the Arctic Emperor Cobra's name? He hadn't been able to see the Arctic Emperor Cobra's actual stats, but he didn't need to in order to understand just how much of a monster it was. For context, Scylla's had not only suppressed it by 80%, but he, himself, had then fused with the Basilisk King on top of that. And even then, if it wasn't for the fact he had been lucky enough to learn how to counter ice poison ahead of time, and also benefited from the Emperor using up all its ether to cast a skill that covered an entire 100-meter radius, he still wouldn't have been able to defeat it. None of that even mentioned the fact that at the start, the Emperor Cobra had been restricted by the system, not allowing it to attack initially. No matter how you looked at it, the Arctic Emperor Cobra was the furthest thing from a normal level 12. Asriel was nowhere near as powerful, and he was a level 15. All signs pointed toward this creature being special, and this seemed to point it out to him. Without hesitation, Scylla clicked yes. This time, there didn't seem to be a list of drawbacks. Though that made him wary, he knew that taking risks like this was the only way forward. Bronze Beast Destiny consumed. Gluttony Seed has strengthened. Quest rewards changed. Bronze Beast. Scylla's heart skipped a beat, then he guessed something. Could it be that there was a grade beyond FFF+? If that was the case, did that mean that from F to FFF+, these were all classified as common beasts, while only creatures above that threshold could be given the moniker of bronze? But it didn't even seem like the Arctic Emperor Cobra had successfully completed its evolution yet in the first place. Just how powerful was a true bronze-grade beast? What Scylla didn't know was that such beasts weren't designed to even be fought alone in the first place. Across the universe, in order to hunt such existences, parties of anywhere from dozens to hundreds were the bare minimum requirement before even trying. And that was just a bronze beast. In the case that it was a silver beast or greater, well, at that point, you would be talking about something entire cities or even worlds would need to get involved in to deal with. But this was also precisely why Scylla's was ranked on the merit leaderboard. When a bronze beast was born, it would become a small overlord all on its own, taking up real territory and forming what was known as a beast domain, the equivalent of a city but for creatures. These beast domains would become spawn points of powerful underlings and the creatures would begin to reproduce in larger numbers. It could be said that if the system cities were an underground, subtle threat that might spring on them when they least expected it, then beast domains could very well lead to the end of a world ahead of time. Such creatures were already beginning to appear as seedlings now, so one could imagine how much turmoil the sudden end of the trial might cause to the world very soon. Right now, However, that wasn't Scylla's problem. He was busy with his new screen. The 6 quest passes had vanished, or more accurately, they seemed to have been fused into one. Arctic Royal, fragmented. The tundra is your domain and poison adorns your chalice. Plus 30 mental. Plus 30 constitution. Stat limit increase, plus 12 per level. Free stats, plus 6 per level. Class modifier, 0.12 intelligence, 0.12 wisdom, 0.12 charisma, 0.12 constitution. Scylla took a breath and accepted the class. He already knew that this would be a painful one, whether it be for the sake of expelling the rest of the impurities from his body, or because of the activation of all of his titles at once. But one way or another, he was determined to do so. Then it happened. Scylla's mind went blank, and for a moment, he thought that it might just be better to die. Had it been the Scyllas before the volcano incident that was lying here on this bed of rock, he might truly have given up in that very instant. His entire body seized, and then a feeling that could only be described in the most vulgar of ways took hold. It felt to him like his body had just been tossed into a blender, countless tiny blades tearing into him from all sides. Blood pulled out from his orifices and pores, tainted with blackened impurities. He could feel his bones creaking and splitting, whining beneath a shocking pressure. Scylla didn't dare to open his mouth. If he did, he would almost certainly end up biting his tongue off. Sweat pulled around him, but it was hard to tell what it was. Instead, it looked far more like droplets of mud and soil falling away from him. As bad as the smell was before, it only grew worse now. Scylla stared at the ceiling of the cave, waiting for the pain to go away. If it wasn't for the veins popping across his jaw, one wouldn't be able to tell just how much pain he was in. There was something particularly cold about his current eyes. He replayed the scenes of the battle he had just fought, remembering them step by step and moment by moment, trying to figure out what he could have done better, and also hoping to be much stronger by the time he would need to act in this way again. As he was lost in these thoughts, the pain only became more excruciating. But when it began to ebb and he could finally feel a sense of clarity once again, he also felt blood rushing to places he didn't want it to go. Scylla shook his head inwardly, still not able to move the way he wanted. He could barely shift his eyes enough to see the tent pitching in his pants. He really hated this world. But his body and inner thoughts seemed to very clearly love it. Chapter 284, Rewards 1. Name, Scylla's Grimblade, Species, Human, F. Affiliation, Grimblade Lineage, Class, Arctic Royal, Fragmented, Profession, Vipermancer, FFF+, Level, 0. Coins, 38,278, F. Titles, A Burning Will, System Breaker, Legendary Tamer, Boss Slayer, Skill Savant, FFF+, Madness Conqueror, FF, Common Arts Enthusiast, F, Aid Patient Stalker, F. Physical, 148 greater than Strength, 140 greater than Constitution, 170 greater than Dexterity, 140 greater than Speed, 140 Mental, 196 greater than Intelligence, 267 greater than Wisdom, 122 greater than Charisma, 200 Will, 363 Luck, 22 Skills, Madness Control, FF+, Basic Scouting, F, Maddened Enlightenment, FF+, Astral Bind, F+, Momentum Shift, F+, Solidify, F+, Master Scouting, FFF, Stunning Spike, FF, Astral Wolfition, FF, Mirror Step, FF, Psychedelic Punch, FF. Comprehensions, Madness, FFF. Gene State, Rigid. Fragmented Genes, Grimblade Lineage, F, Voice of a King, F, Common Genes. Bronze Genes, Basic Etherflow, F, Enchanted Scribe, F. Scylla knew that he didn't have much time, so even before his body had perfectly completed his evolution, he still checked his stats first. But before he could even enjoy the change, he noticed his coin count. There was no way it should be so high. Even though he had killed several, Asriel was definitely a special case. Those level 17s were unlikely to be carrying around so many coins because their resources all came from trades with the government. That was part of how the government managed to keep things under their control. But then he remembered Alex's laughter and the list he mentioned. It seems that I ended up on a leaderboard anyway. Not only that, but where did all my genes go? His common genes had been wiped out, and so had his fragmented genes for that matter. The only genes that remained were the unique ones, but all his physical and mental genes had vanished into thin air. What was especially interesting about this was that despite the fact his genes had vanished, his stats remained the same. Interesting. Could it be that the process of class evolution forced all of those genes to integrate with me? But the stat limits are still in effect. Was it just a sacrifice, then? Regardless, Silas didn't mind it because his stats didn't drop. If the price to pay for undoing a chronic disease was just a few common genes, he was more than willing. With his current strength, it would be too easy to re-up. The only unfortunate thing was that his class didn't increase any of his gene limits. He still had a limit of 20 common genes and 2 bronze genes. But he assumed that that was because it was just a fragmented class. If he upgraded to a bronze class, then it would likely allow him to have a far greater store of genes. That way, he could begin working to break past his limits again. The changes to his stats, however, were only one aspect of classes. Another aspect was class skills. Much like the profession window Silas checked from time to time, there was also a class window. Class, Arctic Royal. Level, 0. Dash. Greater than basic skills. Arctic King's Domain, FFF, skill. Special damage, 20 per second. Special buff, plus 40% to all ice poison skills used. Arctic Howl, FF, skill. Defense, 400. Attribute, Ice Poison. Dash. Chilling Scythe, F+, skill. Damage, 100. Special damage, 20 sec for 5 seconds. Attribute, Ice Poison. Dash. Greater than basic affinities. Ice, bronze. Poison, bronze. Ice Poison, common. Dash. Greater than unlockables. Level 20. Silas raised an eyebrow. The unlockables portion caught his attention the most. Classes weren't set in stone from start to end, they could evolve along with one's level. Often, the better the class, the more evolution hurdles you would have. The weaker fragmented classes wouldn't have unlockables until level 50, but it was obvious that Silas' fragmented class wasn't a normal one and had an unlockable at just level 20. Maybe a gold class might have an unlockable every 5 levels. An unlockable could come in several forms. Sometimes it was a stat limit increase. Sometimes it was an opportunity to upgrade your class to a better version of itself, sometimes it would be a new skill, or even a gene limit increase, or maybe even a special gene itself. It could be a direct reward or an opportunity. It was a roll of the dice depending on the class, and it was also measured by how well one used their class as well. Someone who had great feats with their class would gain better unlockables than someone that was mediocre. So, it could be said that Silas' current unlockables were the worst ones that had a chance to evolve with him in the future. For now, Silas wasn't very interested in what his unlockables were because he hadn't yet reached a point where he felt the need to level up, let alone feeling a need to have to hit level 20. He was still hoping to complete the legendary leg of the quest, so obsessing over improvements to a fragmented class wouldn't do him much good. The second thing that caught his interest were the affinities. He wasn't sure what they meant. What did they help him with? Did they change his ether? Maybe they made it easier to sense certain comprehensions. Made it faster to master certain skills. After asking the madness key, it seemed that the answer was all of the above. Silas' ether had yet to mature because he was still a level 0. However, when the ice poison attribute was added to it, his ether had not only gained a greater defensive character than it had had before, but it was also now comparable to most matured ether. It seemed that while there was no Mancer path greater than another, at least in terms of immediate help, having 2 bronze affinities which matched together to form a common helped him out a great deal. This also informed Silas that there were likely levels to matured ether as well. The higher your affinity, the stronger your matured ether. All of that just left one matter related to his class. Quest received. Path of the Mancer, common. Common reward requirements. Greater than kill a level 20 creature with the ice poison path of the Mancer, OR. Greater than kill level 20 creature with ice path of the Mancer. Greater than kill level 20 creature with poison path of the Mancer, OR. Greater than kill level 20 creature with compatible path of the Mancer, greater than find common evolution stone. Chapter 285, Reward 2. Common Evolution Stone. Scylla's eyes narrowed. The flexibility of this point in the trial was good. The fact that it gave him so many options was beyond his expectations. But what worried him was what he had experienced after the first time. It was clear that for this chain quest, just passing didn't mean you would gain the best results. There was a silent but ever-present grading system hidden. The question was it worth it to try and maximize every level? Or should he try to blitz his way to a legendary class and only do his utmost when he got to that point in the chain quest? Scylla frowned, not quite liking the options. But in the end, he made a decision. He should definitely try to maximize every level. For one, because it was a chain quest, it was highly likely that every step built off another. If he mailed in his effort the first few times, then by the time he got to legendary, he wouldn't have much to build on. Second, these challenges would only get harder with time. In order to clear them within the time he had left, he had no choice but to grow as powerful as possible. And that, obviously, also meant that it was in his best interest to get the strongest classes possible. Now, what he needed was a better way to find path of the Mansa creatures. Not only that, but if they were on the verge of evolution like the Arctic Emperor Cobra, that would obviously be for the best. Scylla took a breath and stood all the way up. Although his body looked disgusting, his muscles were a bit atrophied, and he smelled like the accumulated scum at the bottom of a garbage can, he still felt an unprecedented state of power. When he looked into the hibernation realm, he realized that the Basilisk King was already back to 100% as well. The hibernation realm was truly his best trump card. What Scylla didn't know was that it would only become more useful in the future. Beasts could evolve and reach the status of existences like the Arctic Emperor Cobra, but they likewise took a very long time to evolve. While Scylla's 6,400% speed advantage seemed like a lot now, in the future when the Basilisk King needed orders of thousands to even more years to reach its next stage, it would be invaluable. N-O-V-L-B-J-N.C, on this was the strength of a legendary path. Scylla didn't check his rewards for the QuickTime event just yet. He was more eager than anyone else, but he was also not under the impression that he was out of danger. From what he could tell from the Basilisk King, it usually moved him several times a day. But this time, he had been in this one location for far too long. He needed to move before others found him. And if he could find a place to clean himself, he would like that even more. He didn't fear anyone in his current state, although he didn't want to be cocky about it. What surprised Scylla, though, was the fact that he could neither sense nor feel any danger. Soon, he had settled into a new place and he hadn't even run into anyone looking for him. Deep in the cave, he managed to find a hot spring and he rubbed himself clean more vigorously than he ever had before. When he pulled himself out, he felt so refreshed that he didn't care about anything else anymore, pulled out several corpses and cooked them openly and boldly. He ate so much that it took him an entire day just to finish cooking, to the point that he felt full. I'll definitely have to find a more convenient way to cook. My appetite is too great, and preparing beast carcasses twice the size of my body over a single fire takes way too long. Scylla brushed this off and moved locations again. Then, he finally sat down with glowing eyes. He felt like he was back to 100%, he had fed the dire wolf. The Basilisk King had been in tip-top condition for a long while. There was nothing else holding him back now. It was time. The fact I haven't been bothered until now should have something to do with Alex. I guess this can count as repaying a favor, Scylla thought to himself as he scrolled to a particularly large notification. QuickTime event cleared. Wrath of the Arctic Emperor Cobra completed. Contribution leaderboard. Scylla's Grimblade Bronze contribution. Bronze contribution reward received. Top contributor reward received. Perfect clearance reward received. Against all odds reward received. Merit reward received. A flood of notifications hit Scylla and he was stunned. Were all of these rewards related to the QuickTime event? What was the separation between them? Scylla shook his head. It didn't matter. He would start with the first one. QuickTime event bronze rewards. Choice rewards. Greater than bronze gene crystal, capacity, 150. OR. Greater than bronze city stele quest ticket, OR. Greater than flexible gene elixir, duration, 1 month. Scylla's brows rose slowly. These rewards could be very good, or mediocre depending on how you looked at it. The bronze gene crystal was more than twice as good as the one that Silas received in the past. But because it was so good, it would definitely require him gathering bronze genes this time around at the very least. After all, his last bronze gene crystal only had a capacity of 70, which was why it could still take common genes. But that wouldn't continue to be the case. Now, the Bronze City Stellae quest was likely one of the most valuable things on Earth right now, there was no doubt. But at the end of the day, it was still just a quest opportunity and not the real thing. Silas had a feeling that whatever quest it was would be even harder than this QuickTime event, and the odds that his beast totem would be useful against it were minimal. Finally, the flexible gene elixir was great, but what good was it when you had a gene limit, and stat limits on top of that? Still, it would last an entire month and give Silas 65% chance to absorb all genes during that duration. That was invaluable. Who knew how many times he could break his limits in that time? Which should I choose? Chapter 286, Rewards 3. QuickTime Event Bronze Rewards. Choice Rewards. Greater than Bronze Gene Crystal, Capacity, 150. Greater than Bronze City Stellae Quest Ticket. Greater than Flexible Gene Elixir, Duration, 1 month. Silas stared at the list for a long time. But in the end, he couldn't help himself. Bronze City Stellae Quest Ticket selected. In the end, Silas' thought process was simple. He had seen gene elixirs and gene crystals in many other places. But this was the first time he had seen such a thing. Although the other things were great, they also had their weaknesses on top of this as well. Gathering 150 bronze genes would be a tall task and take him a great deal of time. During that moment, the gene crystal wouldn't be able to give him any immediate benefits either. As for the flexible gene elixir, there were only so many genes that he could absorb. His cap for common genes was still 20 as far as he knew, and even if it wasn't, it wouldn't make much of a difference because his bronze gene limit was still 2. To maximize the elixir, he would probably have to let it sit around for a while too. By comparison, he wouldn't be able to use the ticket immediately either, but its potential for use was much greater, whether that be as a pawn, for personal use, or even to be sold to the highest bidder. In the end, the rare option that he had never seen before felt the best to him. So, he took it. A bronze ticket that looked like a bronze leaf appeared before him. It was reflective and seemed both fragile and flexible, as though with a single intention, he could rip it in half. Yet, organizations around the world would likely fight bloody wars for this chance. If the Grimblades weren't lying to him, even they weren't willing to take a chance on this valuable ticket until it was clear that they were going to fail the 6th summoning. Only then did they use theirs and claim a Bronze City Stellae to prepare for the 7th. Now, Silas had such a thing in his hand as well. After staring at it for a long while, he stored it in his madness key. He didn't know when or even if he would use it at all. But he knew that one way or another, he would benefit from it in the future. QuickTime Event Top Contributor Rewards. Rewards. Greater than Bronze Slot Machine. Greater than Tickets, 339. Silas' gaze flashed. This was good. Last time he had a slot machine, he started off with a fragmented one, but this one started from bronze immediately, and he actually had so many tickets. He still wasn't sure how the tickets were calculated, but it was likely related to his contributions. He just didn't know what the conversion was. Either way, he immediately sacrificed 50 tickets to upgrade to a silver slot machine. He was about to sacrifice more when his lip twitched. I have to sacrifice 250 tickets to gain a gold slot machine. If he did that, he would be left with just 39 tickets left. Was it worth it? Silas took a breath and decided to go for it. Either way, he still had more rewards to go after this. The aura of a gold slot machine was powerful. It made Silas feel insignificant, and at the same time, he was shocked that there was actually such a big gap between gold and silver. What he didn't know was that gold was effectively the peak of the world in many cases. The number that could have legendary anything was so few that this was functionally the truth. In addition, it wasn't just that the gap between silver and gold was so large, but rather that the gap between each subsequent level was inevitably far larger. The runway through the silver grade was much longer and more arduous than the one through the bronze grade, so on and so forth. Silas took a breath and steadied himself, trying to shrug off the pressure to no avail. He slotted his first ticket in. Nothing. He slotted in his second. Nothing. Silas was beginning to feel wary. He blazed through more than a dozen tickets, but he kept returning nothing at all. It seemed like the odds of getting anything plummeted after every upgrade. He should have factored that into his decision. He hoped that he would get something either way. 21 Street. Nothing. 27th. Nothing. 32nd. Nothing. 38th. Nothing. Silas was left speechless, looking at the slot machine that stared back with a stoicism that made it feel like it was looking down on him. He looked at his last ticket and shook his head. He doubted that anything would change. He slid in the last ticket. The slot machine thrummed, and its dials turned. The first image snapped into place. Although it didn't look like anything but a bundle of runes, Silas could vaguely feel what it was. So when the second dial snapped into place, and he recognized the first, he felt a hint of anticipation. He looked toward the last dial, staring at it so intensely that he might have bored a hole through it. It seemed that in his agitation, he had forgotten just the kind of pressure the gold slot machine was exuding. He felt a familiar aura as the dial began to slow. It was so close, right there, if only. The slot machine dimmed as it locked into place. Silas stared blankly. It was just 2 slots away from the rune he needed, but it had failed in the end. He had actually wasted 339 tickets just like that. A sigh echoed, and he shook his head. As he was watching the slot machine, he vaguely began to learn some things. The slot machine could be forcefully upgraded, but not without a cost. From the runes, he could see that the odds plummeted with every upgrade. If he had used it at the bronze grade, he would have had at least a 10% chance. By the time he upgraded it to gold, he didn't even have a single percent chance. The penalty was obviously also greater the higher grade as well, or else he wouldn't have benefited at all the last time he upgraded a slot machine. Silas shrugged it off and focused. He would just have to keep this in mind and hope the next slot machine he met started off at a higher grade. Chapter 287, Rewards 4. QuickTime Event Perfect Clearance Rewards * Choice Rewards. Greater than Silver Slot Machine. Greater than Silver Quest Template. Silas frowned. He didn't quite understand what it meant to receive another slot machine reward because this time, it didn't come with any tickets. Soon, however, he understood after looking at its description. Silver Slot Machine Temporary Treasure. Greater than Does the luck of the gods shine down on you? Or are your hopes and dreams destined to be covered in shallow mud? Greater than Time to Activation, 7 hours 0 minutes and 0 seconds. Greater than Tickets earned, 0. It seemed that the silver slot machine would follow him around and record his feats for a week-long period. Only then would it decide the number of tickets he should be given. What interested Silas here wasn't just the opportunity to get treasures, but it was also a chance to understand the merit system of the slot machines as well. That was enticing in its own right. He always had a fondness for gathering information. Ironically, it was gathering information ahead of time that allowed him to defeat the QuickTime event. But it was gathering information that triggered the event in the first place as well. The Silver Quest template was interesting as well, though. In this case, it was similar to a dungeon map but far more free-flowing. Somewhat like a gene crystal, he would give the Silver Quest template something he wanted to do or accomplish, and then it would give him an outline for how to do so and reward him for accomplishing it. The last time he got a Silver Quest perfectly tailored to him, he managed to make out with a fusion crystal that would be invaluable in refining his future combat path. He just hadn't had the opportunity or time to make use of it yet. However, this Silver Quest would be another chance for that. After some thought, Silas ended up picking the slot machine. The next coming days would be hectic one way or another, so he might as well see what he could make of it. Plus, because it was a silver slot machine, if he gathered enough tickets in the end, he might be willing to upgrade it to gold again and take another chance. QuickTime Event Against All Odds Rewards. Choice Rewards. Greater than Random Upgradable Title and Title Sequence. Greater than Against All Odds Title Bronze. Silas' gaze flickered. Against All Odds Title. Greater than Pressure Makes Diamonds and apparently you as well. Others crumble beneath the pressure, but you push through and perform better against all odds. Greater than Title Devours Boss Slayer. Greater than plus 20% all stats when facing 10 or more enemies 5 or more levels above you, I see. But what's a title sequence? The moment Silas had the thought, he recalled something. The first time he entered a nexus through Castle Main, he was able to find a method to unlock the Common Arts Enthusiast title. It gave him a step-by-step guide on exactly what he had to do. A title sequence should be a formal way of saying that. Realizing this, Silas hesitated before choosing the first option. Title unlocked. Greater than title, shake of the die, F+. Greater than the odds shift ever against you, but you're more than willing to play them. Greater than title devours boss slayer. Greater than plus 0% minus 5% boost in all stats randomly when facing 10 or more enemies 5 or more levels strong. Progress to upgrade. Greater than 1/3 10-on-1 melee fight completed. Silas nodded. He had expected the title to be much worse than against the odds. But the fact that he had an upgrade path was interesting, especially considering the placement of Shake of the Die in his title menu. Titles: A Burning Will, System Breaker, Legendary Tamer, Shake of the Die, Skill Savant, FFF+, Madness Conqueror, FF, Common Arts Enthusiast, F, A Patient Stalker, F. It had appeared right along with the other titles that didn't have ratings next to them despite the fact it clearly said that it was an F+ title. Clearly, this was a hallmark of titles that could be changed and upgraded. It was no wonder a flexible will had evolved to become a burning will. But unlike those other titles, he knew exactly how to upgrade this one. The only shame was that he had lost Boss Slayer, which was much easier to activate than against all odds considering only one enemy needed to meet the requirements. But if it scaled properly, maybe this title could become even more useful to him than Boss Slayer had been. Feeling somewhat satisfied with his choice, Silas moved on to the next reward. Until now, he had gotten a lot of rewards. But they were mostly things that had to be delayed for one reason or another. He had yet to get anything that he could benefit from right here and now. Although he felt that he had made the right choices, anyone would feel a little bitter about this, especially since he had put his life on the line and missed out on so many corpses and the genes. Silas still felt angry when he thought about this. He would definitely remember this favor. The only saving grace was that he still had the Arctic Emperor Cobra's corpse. Hopefully, its value would far outweigh the others. Well, that and he had one more reward to benefit from. QuickTime Event Merit Rewards. Choice Rewards. Greater than Bronze Gene Crystal, Capacity, 200. Greater than Destiny Quest Ticket. Greater than Flexible Gene Elixir, Duration, 6 months. Silas stared at this screen for a long while. He felt conflicted. It was too difficult to decide. He had no idea what a Destiny Quest was, but after seeing what the Gluttony Seed could do for him, how could he not be interested? A Destiny Quest was surely a big deal. He could even feel that his luck was circling it like a shark that smelled blood. The trouble was that it also felt this way for the other two. The Bronze Gene Crystal with 200 capacity should be a perfect Bronze Gene Crystal. It would allow him to unlock his limits to a ridiculous degree. A common gene was 10 stat points, but a single bronze gene was 200. If he could have a full slate of 20 bronze genes, just what kind of changes would he undergo? But to have flexible genes for an entire half year, there was no way he could overlook such a thing, especially with extricated his beck and call. Silas was torn by indecision. It seemed that whatever choice he made, he wasn't destined to have any immediate rewards. However, he would be able to forge himself into a monster. He closed his eyes, waiting in silence for a long while before he opened them sharply. He had made a decision. He was already on the destiny quest of another and stuck on a time crunch for it as well. If he got distracted by another quest on top of that, the madness key might very well eat him alive. The flexible gene elixir sounded great, but was one of his rewards for appearing on the merit leaderboard one as well. Although that one would only last a few days and not 6 entire months, Silas didn't need such an elixir to last for so long. Plus, what if he found a better elixir in that time and wanted to use it? The period was handicapped by being too long. In the end, he chose the final one remaining. The perfect bronze gene crystal. It was about time basic Etherflow got an upgrade. Chapter 288, Flow, Bonus. Etherflow, F. Common Gene. Raise genetic limit to 5, bronze genes of a kind, raise stat limit to 200 relative stat units, N, O, vel, B, JN.C, gene talents, etherflow, F. Bronze gene. Raise genetic limit to 10, bronze genes of a kind, raise stat limit to 300 relative stat units. Gene talents, etherflow, F. Silver gene. Raise genetic limit to 20, bronze genes of a kind or 1, silver gene of a kind, raise stat limit to 500 relative stat units. Gene talents, etherflow, F. Rune flow, F. Common gene. Raise genetic limit to 5, bronze genes of a kind, raise stat limit to 200 relative stat units. Gene talents, etherflow, F. Bronze gene. Raise genetic limit to 10, bronze genes of a kind, raise stat limit to 300 relative stat units. Gene talents, etherflow, F. Silver gene. Raise genetic limit to 20, bronze genes of a kind or 1, silver gene of a kind, raise stat limit to 500 relative stat units. Gene talents, etherflow, F. Skill flow, F. Common gene. Raise genetic limit to 5, bronze genes of a kind, raise stat limit to 200 relative stat units. Gene talents, etherflow, F. Bronze gene. Raise genetic limit to 10, bronze genes of a kind, raise stat limit to 300 relative stat units. Gene talents, etherflow, F. Silver gene. Raise genetic limit to 20, bronze genes of a kind or 1, silver gene of a kind, raise stat limit to 500 relative stat units. Gene talents, etherflow, F. Etherflow. Ether comes naturally to you, even when it's outside of your body. Your ability to extend your ether away from your core, attaching it to objects to control and wield, far exceeds others. You have now reached a new step of mastery. +20 intelligence, +20 charisma common. +40 intelligence, +40 charisma bronze. +80 intelligence, +80 charisma silver. Requirements to unlock silver. 22 strength, constitution, dexterity, speed, wisdom. 44 charisma. 44 intelligence. 1 basic etherflow. 1 less than Mitchcraft title, FFF plus title. Rune flow. Ether comes naturally to you, even when it's outside your body. The runes of the world are your conduit, and the laws, abstruse and untouchable to others, come to you of their own volition. +20 wisdom. +20 charisma, common. +40 wisdom, +40 charisma, bronze. +80 wisdom, +80 charisma, silver. Requirements to unlock silver. 22 strength, constitution, dexterity, speed, intelligence. 44 charisma. 44 wisdom. 1 basic etherflow. 1 enchanted scribe. Skill flow. Ether comes naturally to you, even when it's outside your body. Layer your skill, cast multiple at once, and even instant cast. The limitations of others do not apply to you. +20 intelligence, +20 wisdom common. +40 intelligence, +40 wisdom bronze. +80 intelligence, +80 wisdom silver. Requirements to unlock silver. 22 strength, constitution, dexterity, speed, charisma. 44 wisdom. 44 intelligence. 1 basic etherflow. 1 skill savant title. When Silazin put his own gene talent into his perfect bronze gene crystal, he didn't expect that this would be the result. Honestly speaking, he was just expecting 1 gene talent to come out the other end, but he ended up with 3, all of which seemed to be enticing. Whether it was etherflow, rune flow, or skill flow, they all had their enticing characters. Etherflow spoke for itself. It was an upgrade to basic etherflow, and it was exactly what he was looking for in this process. Rune flow would be considered a perfect upgrade for both his basic etherflow and his enchanted scribe gene talents. Skill flow, in comparison, was the one that deviated the most from his current path, but the power of skills couldn't be denied. The ability to cast multiple skills at the same time would be overwhelming in battle. It had to be remembered that even the likes of Azrael had died to Silas because he couldn't cast a second skill fast enough. After Silas weathered the first storm, he had no choice but to stare down the barrel of the ballista and wait for his death. Even a level 15 that was so powerful had fallen in front of just some good timing. That weakness was something that even Alex had fallen prey to just days earlier. However, just like every time he had been faced with this decision, Silas had no choice but to poke holes at their weaknesses. Skill flow had the most obvious to him because it required sacrificing his skill savant title. It had to be remembered that skill savant gave Silas a plus 100% boost every time he gained 1 point of intelligence. Not only was it an easy cheat toward increasing his mental, but it was also the easiest way for him to increase one of the most important things to him, his ether stores. If he gave up that title now, who knew when he'd be able to get another one that was even close to as good. As for etherflow, its weakness was twofold. First, he needed to earn a title that he didn't even currently have, and he didn't have any immediate way of knowing if this title was one claimed during previous summons or not. If it was, and he chose this path, he would just be wasting his time and one of the uses of the gene crystal. The second issue was more what it lacked. After looking at skill flow and rune flow, it was hard to feel any fondness for etherflow because it just straightforwardly did what basic etherflow already did, but on a higher level. Then there was rune flow. Its greatest weakness wasn't obvious, but Silas saw through it at a moment of thought. It was hard to explain in a few words, but if Silas had to, it would be like it had taken the intuition and talent out of rune making and forging. Enchanted Scholar didn't give Silas great power, but instead allowed him to see and understand runes. Rune flow, however, at the sacrifice of Enchanted Scholar, turned the focus more toward runes away from it and pushed it toward ether. He would surely be more capable of using powerful runes now, but at the cost of the intuitiveness of doing so. Chapter 289, Quadruple Bonus. Looking at things this way, Silas found it difficult to choose. After some thought, he chose to take a different route. It had been a while since he tread a grey line with the Madness Key. Maybe it was time to take a risk again. Madness Key, Treasure. A key leading to a fortune of madness. Detects other madness disciples and enlightens your path. Contains small spatial world within. Can answer one question in exchange for less than 5 common genes. Curse status, Glutton. Less than 1 bronzy genes a day to maintain happiness. Requirements grow by the day. Less than 6 days remaining until hunger increases. Curse status, cannot be unequipped. Silas took a breath. The Madness Key had finally crossed the common gene threshold, leaving it behind in favor of bronze genes. However, Silas was no longer as flustered or worried about this. That was because he had a trump card. Extricate. Although he had seen very few bronze genes in the wild until now, that didn't matter. He could use his body to farm common genes and then fuse them into bronze genes. Then, he could use Extricate on himself to form the bronze gene he needed. Of course, there was a great weakness to this plan. He had already reached the limit of bronze genes he was allowed at 2, and both of them were gene talent related bronze genes, so he couldn't give them up. However, with this idea in mind, Silas knew that he would just need to find a way to increase his bronze gene limit by 1 and he would be home free. In fact, it was possible that his gene limit had already increased thanks to his class, though he had yet to confirm. The fact that his genes had all suddenly disappeared like that, except for the special ones, was suspicious. What are the Magecraft titles of the FFF Plus grade that are available to me right now? Silas decided to be bold and direct. If he touched upon a taboo, fine. But this decision was too important to not even make the attempt. In fact, he even wondered if it might be possible for him to use his luck to sense if something was going to be a taboo ahead of time. After his luck helped him to perfect his class, Silas realized that maybe he was using it too sparingly. So, as he asked the question, he focused his senses. He didn't feel anything wrong with what he asked, so there was just one thing left. FFF Plus Magecraft titles available to you. Charismatic Enigma. Mind Weaver. Willful Magister. The Meaning of Arch. The Meaning of Sage. Arcane Luminary. Unyielding Scholar. Opening square bracket ... closing square bracket. Silas was surprised to find that there were actually so many. All of these titles were available to him and also FFF Plus in rank. Taking a breath, Silas prepared himself. He had a feeling that this question would be fine. It was the next one that would be troublesome. The one he had planned afterward was likely even more of a red flag. But he was prepared for the risk. What is the description of the FFF plus title Charismatic Enigma? As Silas moved his intention to ask the question, he didn't feel anything going wrong, but his guard was still up. Even so, what happened surprised him. Cost: 1 bronze gene. Silas was taken aback. This was the first time the madness key had ever changed the price on him. However, this was a good thing. Before he even attempted to pay it, though, he prepared to ask his third question first anyway. If what he was attempting wasn't possible, then there was no point in wasting the genes to begin with. What is the title sequence for Charismatic Enigma? Silas watched with focused eyes, feeling a heavy weight on his chest. Cost: 10 bronze genes. Silas released a visible sigh of relief. It seemed that even this was possible as well. That was great. Even if the cost was high, he didn't care. This must be my fault. After I started running into taboo questions, I stopped asking anything related to the system, so I never ran into this possibility. It seems that there's a no man's land between taboo questions and normal questions where there's an extra cost involved. It's steep, but well worth it. Silas wouldn't necessarily find the title sequence he needed in a nexus, but if he asked the madness key. Let's see if I can find out how to improve my Burning Will title. Silas wasn't a fool, he had noticed a qualitative change after he unlocked a Burning Will. Even when he used Etherflow, his will seemed to have become flickering flames instead of its usual glow of ether. On top of that, his telekinesis became able to move up to 50 pounds with greater ease, and his Etherflow fists carried a greater punch as a result. If he could upgrade it further, wouldn't that be helpful? But first, he wanted to see the cost. What Silas didn't expect was that the moment he was going to, he felt a blaring warning echo through his heart. He hurriedly stopped and exhaled a slow breath. No doubt, it was a taboo. I see. Normal graded titles I can ask about just fine. But non-graded, upgradable titles are a no-go. Silas noted this and accepted it. This wasn't a bad result either. There was just one thing he had to check before he truly left this place behind. Arctic Emperor Cobra. Genes detected. Bronze gene, 7, intelligence, F, 7, wisdom, F. Attempt assimilation. Yes, no. Wow. There was nothing else to say. If the Arctic Emperor Cobra was a human and not a beast, it would certainly have even more genes to give. But Silas had already become used to creatures only giving some stats. The fact that the Arctic Emperor Cobra could give 2 of a kind instead of just 1 was a testament to how special it was. If a bronze gene gave 200 stat points, didn't that mean that the Arctic Emperor Cobra had several stats in the quadruple digits? Chapter 290, there. Silas shook his head. This wasn't the real reason he had taken the Arctic Emperor Cobra out. His real goal was something more unfathomable. Its venom sac. After completing his Arctic Royal class, Silas felt that his sense of ice poison had increased manifold, and there was a familiar energy running through him. His ether had changed in constitution, and it was now purely ice poison based as well. He wasn't yet sure what this would do to his normal skills and if he would even be capable of still using them or not, but what he did know was that whether or not his other skills had become useless, this venom sac was a hack for him. This time, Silas didn't need to be nearly as careful in cutting out the venom sac because he was confident in his immunity. However, the body of the Arctic Emperor Cobra was so tough and large that he had no choice but to fuse with the Basilisk King. After an hour or two of arduous and careful work, he had finally cut it up, preparing not just the venom sac but also a great deal of food for himself as well. Holding the venom sac in his hands, he felt very satisfied. The runes on it were far more complex than what he had seen from its son. Not only that, but he had a feeling that if he tried to complete these runes, it would be far easier. His comprehension of ice poison deepened after just a few seconds, and he already felt the skills he had yet to cast even a single time inch toward common mastery from fragmented. Good, just as expected. Silas stood to his feet. It was time to go. As Silas moved through the forest, he realized just how good he felt. There was a slight chill coming from his body, but it actually helped his body to stay cool, and he felt like his stamina got a nice boost because of it. Though, that might also be because his constitution was now 170 rather than 140. Is this the power of mature ether? His body was moving like a far more well-oiled machine, as though his stats meant more. despite not having increased by much. Well, at least his physical stats hadn't. Silas decided to casually make a layer of ether skin for himself, and a beautiful radiance echoed across his body. Blue runes flooded across and formed a thin film of what looked like blue ice. It seemed like just a single touch could cause it to crack apart, yet when Silas punched a tree, he actually managed to leave an indent this time. Not only did he manage to do such a thing, but he also didn't feel much pain from his hand at all. My etherskin is easily several times more powerful now. If before it only took 50 or so damage to blast through it, it would take at least 200 now. This shouldn't be just because Silas had mature ether now, but because ice poison was heavily control and defense-based. It seemed that even in its natural state, without the guidance of a skill, mature ether had its own positives and quirks. There's still nothing around. By this point, the ether of the portal had spread so far that Silas could easily use his skills even here. There was no reason that there wouldn't be beasts present here. Yet, there was nothing. Is this still related to Alex, or? Silas was very confused at first, but as he closed in on the region where the battle had occurred, he came to a sudden stop. The air looked perfectly fine, but there was something extra reflecting in Silas' pupils. Runes. Poison runes. Suddenly, Silas understood. He had underestimated just how potent the venom sac he had thrown out at the last minute was. The Basilisk King had worked itself to the bone, escaping and moving locations from time to time, but it seemed that that had been completely unnecessary. The entire region had become a biohazard. After analyzing the runes for a moment, Silas was confident that it wouldn't be able to harm him at this concentration, so he made his way forward, still careful to pay attention to his body's situation. Luckily, it seemed that he had overthought things once again because the poison couldn't even penetrate his ether skin. In fact, it seemed to have special immunity to poison in specific, suppressing and crushing it. No, there's something extra as well. It's consuming the poison and using it to strengthen itself at the same time. I can even feel that the time limit of my ether skin is actually subtly increasing. This was a pleasant surprise for Silas. It seemed his Arctic Royal class had more depth to it than it appeared. He changed directions a bit and chose to head to the very location he had originally thrown the sack down. The closer he got, the denser the poison in the air was. He was slowly testing the limits of his ice poison, but as far as he could see, it didn't seem to have any. By the time the poison in the air was so dense that he could see it even without Enchanted Scholar, his ether skin had absorbed so much that it exuded a faint violet glow as a backdrop to its icy blue. There. Up ahead, Silas could see even the remains of the poison sac left behind. Aquatic creatures had come belly up to the surface of the river, the grass, trees, and vegetation in the region had collapsed. Even one of the nearby cottages looked as though an entire half of it had been eaten by termites and rotted from the inside out. Silas realized just how much he had underestimated the poison sac now. The bouncer look-alike he had fought was more powerful than he knew. But now, he seemed completely immune to his greatest strength. Not only that, but his own ice poison seemed to be improving. Silas' gaze flashed as he noticed something else. A smile almost tugged at the corner of his lips. Chapter 291, Transformer. Silas jogged forward and appeared by the side of several corpses. These were the people who hadn't managed to escape in time. Their faces were unrecognizable, and there was a sizable number of them here to be sure. The indifference on Silas' face didn't change in the slightest as he poked around until he found what he wanted. He pulled out several storage devices, and when he looked inside, his gaze flashed with a hidden brilliance. There they were, the corpses of the Arctic King Cobras. It wasn't all of them, but between all the spatial devices Silas counted, he found 17 of them, and 2 of them were the level 10 elites. From the 50 total he had had before, this was a far cry. But even so, this was more than he had expected. After checking all of the genes, he came out with a total of 19 bronze intelligence genes. He got 2 each from the elites, and 1 more from each of the rest. No matter which of the bronze gene talents he chose, he would need 22 bronze intelligence genes at best, and 44 at worst. So no matter how he looked at it, this was a huge boon. Plus, even if he hadn't made his decision yet, this would help him satiate the madness key for a long while. Regardless, there was no rush. He needed to gather 198 bronze genes before he could even choose one of the paths to begin with. His focus right now should be either to find a method of increasing his bronze gene limit to 3 so that he could farm common genes, or find where he could battle it out with more bronze gene creatures. But first, he needed to see what the situation over in York City was. It was the reason he had come here in the first place. Silas left the region of the poison and soon found that the ether was plummeting. He checked on his direwolf and saw that it was feeling healthy again, so he summoned it and used it. The direwolf relied on his ether to sustain its stamina, so if the ether concentration in the air dropped too much, it wouldn't be usable anymore. But Silas had a feeling that since so many portals had opened in this region, it wouldn't be a problem. He summoned the Basilisk King once more and then entered his rune training scape. The first door was still mysteriously gone. Silas could only conclude that this world felt that he had already mastered whatever was prepared for him behind it. Whatever the case was, he might as well continue on to the second door. He entered and found himself in a white space. There was a rune, however, before him, and 3 key slots hovering behind it. Silas looked from the rune, then to the locks, and back again. I see. They want me to find 3 keys within this one rune. Isn't this somewhat like what I had done with the ice poison rune? Silas had taken the parts of the ice poison rune he needed, then used it to give himself a barrier of immunity. Of course, the main purpose back then had been to purge the mammoth of the poison that harmed it. This, though, felt way easier than that. Silas scanned the rune for a moment, and soon a 3-dimensional rendering of it appeared in his visualization. He felt he would be able to recognize it no matter how he turned and flipped it. My wisdom. Silas realized that he could use Enchanted Scribe for longer and analyze runes much more easily because wisdom was basically double what it had used to be. In all likelihood, he could split his mind more ways now, control more things, and there was now a direct translation to runes and rune control. And thanks to that. 3 runes were stamped in the air at the same time, perfect and whole. He pushed the runes forward, and the 3 locks were undone at the same time. A resonant hum thrummed and the floor was cleared. Silas' gaze flashed, and once again, he found himself standing on a familiar path once again. It seemed that he had passed once more after just a single attempt. Silas shrugged his shoulders and entered the 3rd door. He had quite some time because the distance between York City was not only decent, but he planned on going the long way around so as not to attract a lot of attention. Behind the 3rd door, Silas found another floating rune. But this time, the lock was in pieces. I have to make the lock this time. Silas was a bit stumped. He didn't understand the purpose of this test, at least not immediately. Wasn't he supposed to be rune forging? Why did he have to consider? Enlightenment flashed through his eyes. I see. The first test is just about the basics of rune forging. The second teaches rune deconstruction and gives you the tools to analyze and learn from existing runes. The third teaches you how to reverse engineer runes. By understanding a rune enough to comprehend the lock it could undo, you essentially understand the nuts and bolts of the rune down to its very foundation. Anyone could drive a car, but how many could maintain one? How many could keep its engine oiled and its brakes in top condition? How many could piece its engine together? This rune was teaching Silas true rune construction. It was something that he had done in part with the ice poison rune, but ultimately, he was still heavily relying on the fact he knew that the ice poison sac was good at dealing with and sealing poison. If he was just given a random assortment of runes, would he be able to do the same? Silas' eyes glowed, and he began to look at the rune in earnest, having already memorized the pieces of the lock. Then, he moved, his visualization piecing it together like a transformer. Chapter 292, Proficiency. Silas actually failed on his first attempt, something that he hadn't expected. He thought that the moment he understood the purpose of the challenge, this would just be a simple matter of completing it. This time, it wasn't a matter of control. The trial didn't ask him to complete the lock, per se. It only asked him to deduce it. The pieces of the lock would then form on their own. So the only person that Silas could blame was himself for coming up with the wrong result. No, my answer should be correct, but I'm still missing something. What is it? Silas didn't immediately try again. He watched as the pieces of the lock disassembled themselves, lost in his own thoughts. For some reason, his thoughts flashed to the scene he had witnessed the first time he laid eyes on Earth's runes. They were twisted, chained, and in some cases, they had cancer-like growths on them that looked unnatural. Even without having seen runes before, Silas was still certain that there was nothing about what he was witnessing that was good. Silas shook his head. He didn't feel like these things were related, except for the fact that he had an innate desire to understand more about runes if for no other reason than to understand what had been done to Earth. Done to. Silas' gaze flashed. He thought of those cancerous growths and found them interesting. If someone messed with Earth's runes, it made sense for them to be chained, or even incomplete, but the growths. That seemed odd. It was almost as though Earth's runes had been poisoned or had become diseased. It was like they were living. A realization overcame Silas and he realized something. Had he been too precise? After some thought, Silas applied his solutions again, but this time, he increased the degree of freedom and loosened his precision. As expected, this time, the task was cleared. In fact, it wasn't just the task, but the entire third door disappeared and Silas found himself back on the path once again. Interesting. I don't actually think that that's the lesson the door wanted to teach me. The problem with Silas' first answer was that it was too good. It didn't allow for the rune to breathe, and treated it like a real key with precise dimensions that could only work for equally as precise locks. But he was treating runes too mechanically. No two trees were identical, no two blades of grass, no two creatures, no two rocks. Nature had patterns, but even within those patterns, there was a degree of variation. Runes were the same. No two runes were perfectly identical, and even within a closed system of a single rune, there would be variation as it interacted with the world. Silas felt that he had touched on something profound. If I create runes with this in mind, the pressure on my mind will lessen considerably. My rune construction doesn't need to be perfect and stringent. It's like writing. So long as it's legible, it will work. Within reason. This within reason, of course, referred to the pieces that fit together to form the rune. If rune forging was like writing, then the form of writing it was had to be cursive. The letters linked together, and if one was too far bent out of shape, it wouldn't be able to accommodate the others. Truly fascinating. Silas found himself becoming endlessly interested in this world of runes. If he was correct, and runes were like aspects of nature, then wasn't controlling them similar to controlling the building blocks of life? Just how far could you take such a thing? Too eager to dismiss those thoughts, Silas hurried forward and entered the fourth door. It had been a long while since something had caught his attention like this, and when he found something to be curious about, it was unlikely that he would stop until he had exhausted it to the greatest extent. With the foundation laid, the fourth door began to truly train Silas. It taught him the most common building blocks of runes and he began to learn their formal names. It turned out that his casual naming of the building blocks of the ice poison rune weren't entirely off base, but they weren't entirely correct. He thought that the ice poison rune was formed by 12 runes, when in reality, it was actually over 30. This wasn't because Silas had missed some, but rather because he had grouped them together in groups that were too large. The foundations of runes were known as strokes. These strokes came together to form foundations. And only these foundations could come together to form runes. No matter the rune language, all strokes were ubiquitous. However, there would be some variations in the foundation. Still, if you understood the strokes well enough, it was theoretically possible to comprehend all rune languages. It was just that, there were far too many strokes. Just this fourth door required Silas to memorize 36 of them. And just when he thought he was finished, the fifth door had him memorize 3 sets of 100. Finally, the sixth door actually asked him to memorize 3 sets of 1,000. In the end, just this one alone taught him 3,336 strokes. That said, Silas wasn't disheartened at all because the strokes were truly fascinating in their own right. The ice poison rune was made up of 32 foundations and 127 strokes. What was interesting about strokes was that they had power too. Not as much power as runes, of course. But they were also far easier to use. However, Silas didn't look into using strokes in battle much. The ratio of the effort he would put in versus what he would get out certainly wasn't worth it. At least not for now. Silas moved on and entered the 7th door. Whether it was the 7th, the 8th, or the 9th doors, they all did the same thing: test his proficiency. Seeing this, Silas immediately lost interest. There was nothing left to learn. It could be said that the moment he finished with the 6th door, he had gained everything there was to gain. Here. Chapter 293, A Long Way. Silas woke up from his stupor, having cleared the 9th door in just a few seconds. The final 3 doors had been far too easy, but they had also taken the most time to complete. He spent more time on the 7th door than he had the previous 6, and that pattern only continued. However, it was still invaluable for refining his memory and sharpening his rune deployment. I'll have to find a chance to use a nexus again so that I can trade for the next. You have pleased the system, System Breaker. The system is watching you. System reward received. Silas' eyes became sharp. The last time he had read a similar message was when he awakened System Breaker, his title. Back then, he had also gotten a system reward, and that should be part of the reason why he was able to have 3 legendary paths instead of just 1 like most people for his profession. Now, he had received another system reward, but to what end? He wasn't awakening anything anytime soon, as far as he knew. And, even when he tried to click on the reward, nothing came up. It was like it was completely dormant. However, when Silas looked at his slot machine, his eyes couldn't help but narrow. Tickets, 212. He wasn't sure if he should be happy or disappointed by that. On the one hand, he hadn't even done much yet, but he had already gained so many tickets. But on the other, it felt like an acknowledgement of the system should probably be worth more. Regardless, the system reward is still there. So, I've benefited twice over. That said, there's something fishy about this. Why did the system suddenly reward me for doing something that I would have done anyway? Silas could only speculate, but if he had to guess. His mind flashed to the images of Earth's broken runes. The system had its own rules, but those rules were certainly capable of being broken. The Slithering Madness dungeon had certainly broken one or several of those rules. Then there was the event of the Basilisk King that was another such event. Then there was Asriel's existence, and even the weird Archibald. There was a lot of rule-breaking going on everywhere. So the question was, what was the system's opinion about all of this? It was hard to say. But, on the one hand, Silas was rewarded for breaking the rules with his System Breaker title. But on the other, the Madness Key was a reminder that the system wasn't willing to allow just anything to slide. Then there was Asriel, who was clearly suppressed in every way, even to the point where Silas couldn't even benefit from his genes. There was definitely something odd about that as well. The system was hard to read, but it was clear that it wasn't entirely happy with everything going on under its nose, and sometimes it would take action. Whether that action was to reward or punish, it was hard to say. But right now, the system seemed to be rewarding Silas for studying runes, and if Silas was correct, that might very well be related to the current state of Earth's laws. If the system was like an unbiased arbitrator, it would want new worlds to have the time to grow into their own instead of being messed with by the big brothers, so to speak. It might very well want to help give Silas the tools to fight back against this. Silas cleared his mind and began to focus on the world around him. The dire wolf was currently sprinting adjacent to a long highway, diving through thick trees. Silas was familiar enough with the roads here to follow them to his destination, but not enough that he could find a path without them. So following them like this was the next best option, although it was risky. These were the exact sort of paths that the government and legacy would be paying close attention to. But he had mitigated that risk to some extent by taking a longer, meandering route. If the city lord who claimed an island of York City was, indeed, Kassarai, then it would certainly be quite difficult to get to her. Setting aside the fact the waters around it had become turbulent due to the appearance of yet another portal on the ocean's floor, the island in question would definitely be easily monitored. And unless Silas followed the river he had just left behind all the way up and through the raging waters, there was no way to cut around all the inevitable security. Of course, Silas would be willing to do this, but not without first confirming that it was actually Kassarai. As for the underwater portal, he already had a method of dealing with it. It was just a matter of actually laying eyes on it, which would certainly be easier said than done. Silas put the Basilisk King away and urged the dire wolf forward. For this final stretch, he needed to be on top of his game. His senses focused on every little detail within a 30-meter range. He found that with his wisdom being higher, it was much easier to do this, though it was still quite a strain on the mind. N-O-V-E-L-B-J-N.C, By this point, they had already left a dead zone of ether and the concentration was picking up again, letting him know that they were rapidly approaching York City. Soon, Silas began to see familiar roads and he was sure that the first barricade was up ahead. He slowed the dire wolf down to about half its top speed. But even that was over 100. When he was just about 300 meters away, Silas came to a full stop and put the dire wolf away. I'll have to capture someone high enough up on the chain of command that they'll have the information I need. Having thought of this, Silas patiently sat and watched. He couldn't help but recall the very first title he had awakened, Patient Stalker. He had certainly come a long way since then. Chapter 294, Short. The blockade was stronger than anything Silas had seen in Lone Star, but that only made sense considering the state of this side of the world. They were probably prepared for the intervention of Legacy at any moment. But one way or another, Silas had to go. Sergeant Cherie looked out of a wide glass window. The location was a modernized outpost. Well, that was just a fancy way of saying it was a glass box stacked onto a steel pole. There was nothing special about it other than the fact there was only one way in and one way out. Being over 20 meters in the air, it also gave him a great vantage point to oversee everything and ensure that everyone was following their orders properly. Though, most days, he just ended up being a glorified extra scout. It was a calm job one way or another. He was probably in the safest location there was. Though such a place might usually be cannon fodder for snipers, the glass was far thicker than one could imagine, and there also weren't any vantage points a sniper could take advantage of in this region other than the other glorified outpost. For him and those like him, life after the summons began wasn't too different at all. He still followed the same orders, and though his tasks could err on the side of weird from time to time, there was nothing to complain about. All things considered, the odds of Legacy doing much of anything were too small. So his job could be considered to be quite cozy. Sergeant Cherie was just thinking these thoughts when the situation changed. He didn't even see it personally. The forest was definitely a vulnerability, but the issue was that before their outpost, the forest had long come to a stop. There was nothing but paved roads and flat land between here and the first patch of sparse forest. And yet, the first sign of something wrong that Sergeant Cherie grasped was the commotion. Silas knew that there was no way for him to sneak into the city. The government wasn't incompetent no matter what biases he might have against them. In that case, the best course of action was to do the one thing they didn't expect. While Sergeant Cherie was busy scanning vulnerable regions, Silas burst out into a dead sprint, shrouded in black scales. Fused with the Basilisk King, he was so fast that he seemed to leave streaks of black in his wake. He covered his face and hid his tail in a black military uniform he stole. It made him look bloated and ridiculous, but Silas had never cared about such things. His only focus was getting in and getting out. At the same time, while he wanted to rely on his fusion state, he didn't want the government to suddenly be put on alert about his attack. So not only did he hide his tail, he hid his face and most of the changes triggered by his fusion. The moment he crossed the distance he needed to, he dismissed the fusion. His speed plummeted, but his gaze only sharpened. He could feel a slight ache in his muscles already for just a few seconds of use, but it was still far better than it had been in the past. He no doubt had his extra 30 constitution to thank for that. His current state was more than enough to deal with the coming situation. Enemy attack. Silas seemed to hear the voices as though they were whispered in his ears. Some useless information naturally dulled in his mind while important things were amplified to an extreme. With this concentration of ether, it was impossible for anyone to aim a gun at him. But that didn't mean that they couldn't aim arrows. And Silas wasn't sure just yet which was more of a danger. Regardless of what it was, his steps didn't close. The best way to deal with long-ranged units was to force them to hesitate. What would they do when he was running in the midst of their allies? Would they trust their aim to such an extent? Silas' feet hit solid pavement and he scanned the enemies before him. He dodged out of the way of a swinging sword and drove a fist into the man's gut. He didn't even put much power into it, and yet he could feel the ripple through the latter's body as they collapsed like a sack of potatoes. He made a motion that looked as though he grabbed the sword, only to send it flying with his telekinesis to the side, piercing right through the leg of another oncoming agent. He weaved in and out of the swarm of government agents, and he felt more clearly now than ever that the larger the gap in stats, the less actual skill mattered. He had yet to have the opportunity to benefit from the fusion crystal, at least not to a degree that he would be proud of. And yet, these people were like putty in his hands. Bang! Silas slammed a palm against a woman's chest and she was sent flying into the fortified wall. He rushed forward, using the dent he had created with her body to push himself up. It's short. The wall was a tall stack of concrete blocks, and though his stats were outrageous, he wasn't yet to the point of being able to clear 10 meters in a single bound. Silas' gaze flashed and his fingers gripped at the spacing between the concrete blocks. He knew this wasn't enough. Not alone, anyway. His intention moved and he sensed the gluttony seed. Then, he pulled on himself with his telekinesis. His forearm flexed and he unleashed a grunt. Suddenly, Silas, who was over 200 pounds, felt more like less than 80 to his fingers and arm. He pulled himself up with all his force and soared over the last meter of distance, landing firmly on the wall. Chapter 295, Kidnapping. Silas had already seen what was on the other side of the wall with the help of his visualization, so he didn't need to hesitate for even a single instant. There was nothing on the front face of the wall that could be used to leap over it. However, they had no such qualms about the other side, and that was precisely to Silas' advantage. Silas took a leap and landed on a military jeep that likely hadn't moved from this location in weeks given the ether situation. His feet moved like lightning, vanishing in the next instant. A trio of arrows landed where he had just been, but it was like he hadn't even noticed them. Silas was doing his best to not have too many stand-out features be compared to his last appearance. That was why he wasn't making use of his telekinesis. However, he was confident in making it through. He had yet to see a single level 10 in this place, and that only meant one thing. They were no match for him. Silas blazed through their encampment and made it to the bottom of their modernized outpost in a single bound. This was definitely the most dangerous part of his excursion. The issue was that there was only one way up and one way down, which practically made him a live target. However, this was the only way. He needed to capture someone important, and he only had one shot at it. Silas grabbed onto the lowest rung of the ladder, which hung high above his head, and pulled himself up with a strong yank. He scaled the ladder faster than he had ever scaled anything before, but that was when the worrying change occurred. The hatch above opened, and Sergeant Cherie appeared. He was a man with a somewhat delicate appearance and seemed to be more of a pencil pusher than a military man. But right now, the dagger in his hand was about as dangerous as it could be. Sergeant Cherie cocked his arm back and unleashed the dagger. It flew forward swiftly, whether by gravity or Sergeant Cherie's strength alone, it appeared before Silas' brows in the blink of an eye. Even if Sergeant Cherie wasn't a great marksman, he didn't have to be. There was only one place that Silas could be, and there was only one place he could go. To make matters worse, Silas was even accelerating toward the dagger. Silas' gaze flashed and danger blared warnings in his mind. Too fast. The trajectory of the dagger was painted in his mind in red. He could see where it started, where it would end up, and even the path it took in between them. But knowing was one thing, being fast enough and agile enough to do something about it was another. That was when Silas did something completely unexpected. He hooked his knees into the ladder, leaned back, and suddenly unleashed a furious punch. He was no longer the former Silas. Since these scorned raps wouldn't allow him to have weapons or armor, he would have to be his own weapon and armor. Be strong. Bang! A blazing wall lit up Silas' fist and 3 projections of his fist layered onto his own. The echoes of 4 attacks reverberated in such quick succession that they sounded like one. The dagger was sent spiraling back upward even faster than it had come, and that was exactly when Silas took the opportunity to stealthily use his telekinesis to send it right back at Sergeant Cherie. Fast. Sergeant Cherie stumbled backward in an attempt to dodge, and that was precisely what Silas wanted. He unhooked his knees in a fluid motion, planted the tips of his toes onto the rung of the ladder, and sprang upward like a cheetah. He crossed the rest of the 20-meter distance with blazing pace, appearing above the open hatch before Sergeant Cherie had even managed to stand to his feet again. Doom, doom, doom. A rain of attacks landed on the bottom of the outpost, having just missed Silas. But once again, Silas ignored them as though they weren't even there. He made a motion to catch the spinning dagger in the air, but in reality, he never touched it as he used his telekinesis to send it flying towards Sergeant Cherie. The baby-faced man was too caught off guard and thought he would just have to die when the blade pierced right into his leg. Silas rushed over to the window of the outpost, knocking on it with a finger and then frowning. It seemed that there was no chance to break this window, it was far too thick. He turned back and knocked out the screaming sergeant with a fist to the chin, hauled him over his back, then looked toward the hatch. With a leap, Silas jumped down, not even using the ladder. His advantage was the suddenness of his attack, so he couldn't afford to let them react now. Screams of horror echoed out. It seemed that most still weren't used to the new world. A fall from 20 meters would be a guaranteed death on pre-summoning Earth. But it was no longer pre-summoning Earth. Bang! Silas landed on the ground heavily, bending his knees and wincing. It seemed that this was a heavy fall for him even with his constitution, but now wasn't the time to mind it. Using Sergeant Cherie like a shield, he swung him out when he needed to and accelerated toward the wall. After his experience with Archibald, carrying a person and running was no longer an issue for him, his speed didn't even take a hit. He activated Sudden Burst, and though it was no longer able to instantly get him to his top speed, it was still able to give him the little boost he needed to slip out of the onslaught of a few boulder archers. Silas reached the wall, slamming a foot on a trash can, onto the back of a tall immobile SUV, and then leaping over the wall in a single bound. He landed heavily on the other side, activated his fusion, and then flashed off into the distance with a speed that the others simply couldn't keep up with. Chapter 296, Marine Bonus. Oof. Coughs echoed out as Sergeant Cherie was startled awake after Silas tossed him against a tree. When his vision cleared, all he could see were a pair of cold green eyes staring back at him. The sergeant was startled and tried to scramble back, only to realize that there was a tree in his way. "Don't waste my time," Silas said coldly. "Do anything ridiculous and I'll just kill you directly." A cold sweat permeated Sergeant Cherie's back. He had just witnessed Silas' strength firsthand. This man had parried a dagger with his fists alone. How could anyone even begin to match up to such a thing? Seeing that the sergeant was obedient, Silas began asking his questions. "What is the current situation in York City?" This. The question was too broad. He didn't even know how to start, let alone where to finish. "Take your time." Silas crossed his arms. Seated across from Sergeant Cherie in the damp soil, he looked so vulnerable and yet not at the same time. Every instinct the sergeant had to attack was forcefully suppressed and ground to dust in a single instant. This man was too unfathomable. Without a choice, he could only begin to explain, talking about how 3 portals had appeared in York City, one in the middle of the city, one on an island opened by a city lord, and the third on the ocean floor, protecting the city lord from a direct confrontation with the government. Silas knew all of this already, but he didn't interrupt. He assumed that there would at least be some difference between what a real high-ranked government official would know versus what a few lackeys of legacy would know. All things considered, Sergeant Cherie was still a level 9 and likely on the government's docket for the next few they would help reach level 10. As expected, Silas was quickly proved correct because the sergeant let slip in his words that there was some conflict underlying all of this. "A York University professor, why did you mention something like that?" Everything about Sergeant Cherie's explanation seemed fine until he brought up something seemingly unrelated. He only mentioned the professor in passing, saying that he was responsible for mapping out the ocean floor and was a part of the task force designated to figure out a way to clear the underwater portal before things became bad. But the way he mentioned it just seemed out of place. Normally, it was something that could be easily glossed over. But for Silas, it stood out like blaring warning signs. Yes. The sergeant panicked suddenly, wondering if he had said something that he shouldn't have. However, seeing Silas' gaze, he realized that he wasn't going to be able to get away with it. Professor Broussard is very important to the government, and it could be said that he's the second in acting command. Silas' expression flickered. He had some understanding of this man. He was quite young as well, being 33 years old from what Silas recalled, and he was likewise a tenured professor. They had had some interaction in the past and had some collaboration related to aquatic serpents. Professor Broussard was a marine biologist and was especially interested in the changes to the ocean when it was so near a city as large as York City. There was no doubt a great amount of pollution and things of the like that the ocean had to suffer thanks to their strive for modernism. Other than this, Silas didn't know much about him. He never really wasted his time trying to understand people much. What he did understand came naturally. If he had to summarize his impression of Professor Broussard, it was fake. If there was one thing Silas was certain of, it was the fact that this man played a character. As for what his true self was like, Silas didn't know. But the fact that his position in the government was so high shocked Silas. He had remembered wondering in the past why the government of York City was subsidizing such fringe research all the time. He had overheard more than one jealous conversation between angsty academics about that very topic. Could it be that the government was heavily investing in ocean research from the very beginning? Silas had hit the nail right on the head. What he didn't know was that one of the main reasons the sixth summoning was lost was because the powers had neglected the oceans too much. There was no rule that said portals could only appear on land, and because of that, they were easily overrun from regions they least expected. By the time they realized that things had to change, it was too late to make a lasting impact. Professor Broussard was just one investment they had made toward correcting this wrong. That still doesn't explain why you mentioned him, Silas said coolly. This man couldn't have become a sergeant by being an outright moron. By Silas giving him such an open-ended question, his instinct should have been to pretend as though he was telling everything he could while actually hiding as much as he could get away with. He should have left the burden of unearthing the fact on Silas. But he hadn't. That was odd. This. Sergeant Cherie looked into Silas' eyes but saw nothing but an abyss staring back at him. He coughed, feeling a great pressure. He didn't know what it was, but talking to Silas felt heavier on his heart than any general he had spoken to in his entire life. These are just petty rumors. I have no confirmation, Sergeant Cherie spoke, kicking himself inwardly. His superiors had already told him to stop gossiping so much, but what else was there to do in the barracks besides talk shit and fuck? But it's said that Professor Broussard had a falling out with a fellow marine biologist, and that might be related to the sudden appearance of the new city lord. Silas' gaze flashed with a dangerous light. Casseret's mother was a marine biologist. Chapter 297, Storm, Bonus. Was it a coincidence? Silas felt that that was unlikely. What was their disagreement about? I really don't know. All I'm aware of is the fact the government gave Professor Broussard too much power. He's not the leading figure in his field, but no one knows more about this section of the ocean than he does, so in most cases, what he says, goes. I can only assume that there was some dissent in opinion about how to approach this matter, and he didn't take kindly to it. Now that the cat was out of the bag, the sergeant could only be honest. But there was nothing else to say on the matter. This was everything he knew. When does the government plan to make a move? Silas asked. Sergeant Cherie hesitated again, but this time, Silas understood without him even saying anything. It seemed that the government didn't have a plan, or rather, not having a plan was the plan. The two portals were obviously in contention. No matter who the city lord was, it was inevitable that they'd have to deal with a flood of beasts, not just coming toward their city because of their own portal, but even more coming from the underwater portal. Why let either one take advantage of them when they were likely to destroy one another? Obviously, the sergeant could guess at this too. Silas continued to ask the sergeant questions about the city to the point where the man's head spun. After he was satisfied, he knocked him out again and then vanished. This time, killing the man would do Silas no good, so he let him live. In fact, letting him live this time might actually benefit him more than harm him. That was because the last string of questions he had asked the sergeant were nothing more than a misdirection. Even the sergeant probably couldn't have guessed that Silas got all the information he needed out of their first 5 minutes of interaction and only continued for another half hour to lead him down a different trail. Silas returned to the river. After this series of questions, he was about 90% sure that the city lord was Kassarai. He still didn't know what conflict led to Kassarai making such a reckless decision, but right now, Silas knew he had to make it there. The question was, how? Scylla's steps came to a stop in front of a small fishing boat. Compared to the small yachts that dotted the backyards of most of these cottages, it was quite minimalistic, but it was still sleek and quite modern, all things considered. Perfect. Scylla jumped in and then summoned the Basilisk King. Using the rope that had held the small fishing boat to the cottage, he tied the Basilisk King to the vessel. With a sway of its long, powerful body, the Basilisk King rocketed forward through the water, vanishing beneath the surface. No motor, no problem. The Basilisk King proved to be a strong swimmer. As far as Scylla knew, his dire wolf mount could be used in the water as well. However, not only would it cost more ether to sustain it, but it would also suffer a 50% hit to its top speed. The hit would be even worse when the weight of the boat was taken into account. Of course, there were aquatic mounts that didn't have such problems. But it seemed that the Basilisk King was a better solution for this than he could have ever expected. Scylla took a breath and focused. This trip could very quickly become dangerous. If he had really wanted to just use the ocean and river as a path, he could have made use of his ether to walk on the water. But that wasn't good enough for several reasons. First, his visualization was both distorted and far more limited when trying to sense things through water. If these were just normal waters, that would be fine. But these were waters where, presumably, there would be oceanic beasts coming. He couldn't afford a range as limited as 5 meters in this situation, so he had to rely on the eyes of the Basilisk King. Second, he needed some added flexibility. There would no doubt be battles to come, and if he couldn't have a foothold when he needed it, his death wouldn't be far away. This was the best he could do. Of course, this matter wasn't just about saving Kasari either. Just like he had said before, she had managed to survive so long on her own, she most likely didn't need him to suddenly swoop in. Although her village's combat power was lacking, Castlemaine had once been ranked number 1 among cities. That meant something. Still, there were 2 main reasons Scylla insisted on doing this. First, the next step of his plans was inextricably linked to Kasari. He couldn't have a village himself because he couldn't afford to be locked down to a single place, so Kasari was perfect for this. He needed to find a way to connect with her, he just didn't expect that it would happen like this. According to their original plans, they were supposed to find a path to the Amazonian wilds on their own and then meet up. That, of course, included Scylla's, Morgan, and the others. And the second reason, well, what better way was there to gather merit for the silver slot machine other than jumping into the thick of conflict? It took the Basilisk King a half hour of following the river before it made it out. Scylla put it back into the hibernation realm for a time so that it could recover from any poisoning it might have suffered, then they continued minutes later. Entering the ocean, Scylla felt small. It was so impossibly vast that one could only feel that way. But when he thought about the power of those who messed with Earth's laws, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever reach a point where even this vast blue expanse was like a drop in his own world. Scylla looked into the skies, his mind wandering. It seems that it's about to storm. Chapter 298, Less. The timing couldn't have been worse. At least those were Scylla's initial thoughts until he realized that this might actually help him more than hurt. He didn't know much about marine life, but he did know that they tended to dive deeper into the water when storms hit. This could help him out. The storm was only just starting, and the creatures should have sensed it even before he had. So maybe he would get lucky and lay eyes on the island before they did. Scylla didn't often get so lucky, so he was hoping that maybe there really was a first time for everything. The boat swayed beneath him and the waves began to kick up as the skies darkened, but it was still more than manageable for the Basilisk King. As the storm over the horizon came closer, the swaying of the water became more evident and Scylla's expression had long since become serious. He wasn't helpless in the middle of the water considering he could use his ether to walk on it. But it definitely wouldn't be ideal if his boat capsized right now. It'll still take another several hours to follow the water like this and reach the island. I'll just have to take things one step at a time. Scylla let his patience win over his thoughts, but the storm didn't seem to be nearly as patient with him. In fact, the situation was only growing worse. The good news was that no beasts had come to bother him. The bad news was that it wouldn't matter if a current suddenly came and knocked him over and into their territory. Scylla looked off to the side, locking eyes with the coast. He would say that they were about 7 kilometers out at sea, and following the coast was how he had maintained his bearings all this time. Worst come to worst, he would just have to make a beeline toward it and deal with whatever came afterward. From here, he couldn't see any obvious signs of patrols, and that wasn't too surprising. After all, after the underwater portal appeared, the ocean was basically a no-go zone. If it hadn't been, Kasari, or whoever the city lord was, would have already been overrun and captured, while their city would have become the property of the government. The boat suddenly rocked and shook, a wave of water rising over the sides and splashing Silas. Not good. Getting wet was one thing, but the boat. Silas grabbed for a bucket nearby and began unloading the water that had just formed. The process was too slow, so he tried to use his telekinesis, but it was difficult. The first time he used his telekinesis was actually on water, he remembered that vividly. But those had been calm waters, and these waters, well, not only were they far more aggressive, but water in large quantities could very easily become very heavy. There was only so much that he could do to stop it or unload it. However, after a few minutes, Silas got the hang of it. He separated the water into bowls of 30 pounds or so, which was as much as 13 to 14 liters at a time. When he got the hang of it, the amount he moved increased exponentially. Silas was able to keep the boat afloat just like this without slowing down the Basilisk King for another hour, and by this point, they had made great progress. But it unfortunately seemed like something would always go wrong when Silas was involved. The Basilisk King continued to move. Silas could no longer see it clearly through the waters, but through their connection, he could feel that it was doing just fine. It was near enough to the surface that it had to deal with the rampaging currents as well. But its stats were so robust that this was hardly an issue. It pierced through the waves like a blade. A clap of thunder rang through the skies after a flash of lightning. The skies had darkened considerably by now, but the flash made it feel as bright as day and the booming thunder nearly ruptured Silas' eardrums. He couldn't help but frown. Had thunder always been this loud? That didn't seem to be the case. He had a fleeting thought about whether ether might make the storms of Earth more dangerous and violent before his heart shook. Off in the distance toward his right, opposite the coastline he was following, a wave was beginning to form. Silas' jaw clenched. He realized that there was no amount of telekinesis that was going to help him this time. He made a quick decision and communicated with the Basilisk King. With a touch, he had already sent it into the hibernation realm. The boat tipped off to the side and Silas could already feel a harsh swaying coming from it. He lost his footing and nearly fell off before he crouched down and stabilized himself. He grabbed the side of the boat and jumped off just as the wave was about to consume him. With just a second to spare, he managed to store the boat in the madness key before the wave, as tall as 5 meters, consumed him. Despite the situation, Silas didn't panic. With his current constitution, holding his breath for several minutes shouldn't be an issue. It was just a question of if he was a strong enough swimmer to make it out. I weigh less in the water. Silas immediately had this thought the moment that he was swallowed up. He stamped a foot and pushed with his telekinesis. He pulled on the gluttony seed at the same time and swam upward with a strong stroke. Almost immediately, Silas found himself piercing out of the water. In fact, he had pushed too hard, causing him to appear as much as 2 meters above the surface. He landed heavily on the surface of the water, his ether keeping him upright. Unfortunately, he didn't even get a chance to celebrate before a 20-meter tall wave appeared above him. Chapter 299, Shadow. There was no suspense. This time, Silas was completely washed out and he couldn't surface nearly as easily. It was impossible to rely on buoyancy when there was this much water crashing on him from above. The downward force would overwhelm whatever upward force he could benefit from. Silas found himself buried several meters beneath sea level, but he was still calm. So long as he could orient himself, it wasn't a problem. He could still point out the direction of the coastline, he knew which way was up, and he knew which direction he was going. Rather than trying to fight against the current, he allowed it to carry him deeper, using a combination of his telekinesis, dexterity, speed, and strength to rush forward. With the help of all of these things, Silas actually found that he was faster in the water than he would have been on land. Although his agility was lacking, when it came to straight-line speed, he felt that he was close to the pace of the dire wolf. If it applies like this, can't I use my telekinesis to bolster my body as well? Silas felt that the whole path of telekinesis was odd. There were too many questions about it and it was hard to follow. For example, he could split his mind several ways. The higher his wisdom, the more ways he could split them. And, theoretically, each one of his split minds should have the same strength. If one extrapolated that to its logical conclusion, then if he split his minds, and each one could exert the same strength, then if he layered them, why couldn't they multiply their strength? If one mind could lift 50 pounds, then 2 should lift 100, and 4 should lift double that. Silas had tried this out many times before, but it never worked as he thought it should. Although there was some boost, it was lackluster compared to what it should be, as though it was being nerfed or restrained by something. Over time, Silas had come to slowly understand that this was because his telekinesis wasn't a force, it was a manifestation of his will. It could act like a force, but it wasn't exactly that. That difference manifested most clearly when it was acting on an object. If Silas' visualization range was a plane, then his telekinesis was almost like indents within that plane. If he made an indent in a certain location, adding a second indent to it took more effort as though he was trying to stretch out that plane further. Adding a third, a fourth, or even more, likewise took even more effort. There was also the matter of range to consider. This wasn't in regard to his visualization, but rather the actual form his will took. Sometimes he could make them into fists, sometimes he visualized his telekinesis in the form of gripping or pinching hands, sometimes he formed bowls or spheres to carry things, and sometimes he would just perfectly coat the item in question. There didn't seem to be much of a difference between these things at all other than the fact the physical of his telekinesis would either be applied over a large area or a small area. As though that wasn't enough, there was also the fact that his telekinesis seemed to have weight limits. Someone with over 200 physical could lift hundreds of pounds with ease, so why was it that even when his telekinesis could exert that sort of influence, it was limited to around 50 pounds? It was all too confusing, even for Silas. All of this didn't even mention the greatest oddity of it all. In fact, Silas believed that unless this question was answered, he might never truly understand. And that question was, where had his telekinesis come from? Obviously, it wasn't just a matter of having high enough will and charisma, or else everyone would have telekinesis. He arbitrarily guessed that it was related to his madness comprehension, but that answer wasn't good enough for him. What about madness allowed him this? When madness was activated, all it did was increase his will and charisma. Its description didn't note any other abilities. And like he had thought before, if will and charisma were all it took, then everyone would have telekinesis. These distracting thoughts almost made Silas forget that he was in the middle of a very dangerous situation. He felt that maybe using his telekinesis directly on his body to bolster his speed might be useful. If he felt 50 pounds lighter, for example, how much faster would he be? Truthfully, Silas was letting his thoughts roam like this because while the situation seemed helpless, it was actually very easy to manage. Even after half a minute, he felt no immediate urge to breathe, and he was still rushing forward with great speed. He should have already left the range of the tall wave, so there should be an opportunity to return to the surface too. Plus, this excursion had given him new ideas, so all in all, it was a win in his books. Still, such a tall wave is odd. York City was known to suffer hurricanes from time to time, but they weren't nearly as lethal as one might expect nearer the tropical regions of Earth. Plus, it was winter now, so they were already out of hurricane season. It made no sense for there to be such tall waves unless his previous guesses were correct. Had ether already made Earth a more dangerous place than they knew yet? As Silas was lost in thought again, analyzing everything he could, his gaze sharpened. He had used his less than basic night vision skill already because the waters were too turbulent and dark. This ended up helping him out somewhat, but the range of his visualization was still only 5 meters or so. So when he saw the shadow in the distance, he couldn't help but cringe. The shadow was too large. A whale. Sperm whale, FFF+. Level, 4. Physical, 431. Mental, 57. Will, 75. Chapter 300, Howl Bonus. Sperm whale, FFF+, level, 4. Physical, 431. Mental, 57. Will, 75. Silas' jaw clenched. Seeing this creature confirmed something that he had been thinking about for a long time. If stats were scaled based on human biology, then how much stronger were the real predators of Earth? What about the extinct predators of Earth? If he ran into a blue whale, what kind of physical stats would it have just by virtue of its sheer size? A sperm whale wasn't nearly as large as a blue whale, and yet just staring at these stats. A true monster. Silas forced his heart to remain calm. He had to control himself even more in this situation because he was in another creature's territory and oxygen wouldn't come easy in this situation. Wasting what stores he had would be inadvisable. This whale also wouldn't necessarily attack him. The head of the sperm whale was enormous, and its eyes. Doom. Silas heard the sound first and saw the streaks of water second. The sperm whale suddenly whipped its tail, leaving an echoing hum through the water before appearing before him in a flash. Weren't whales supposed to be docile creatures? This was the only thought Silas had time for before he was forced to cross his arms and block. As powerful as the whale's physical was, it too was marred by the water. Its effectiveness was definitely not as high as its stats would suggest. However, none of that would matter if those teeth sank into him. Silas didn't know much about whales. He was under the impression that they were all docile creatures and herbivores to boot. What he didn't know was that the sperm whale ate sharks for lunch and happened to be the largest toothed predator in the world. It could only be said that he was truly unlucky, but his reactions weren't slow. He formed a less than solidify beneath his feet and pressed off of it hard. He pushed himself up and managed to dodge the open maw of the sperm whale, but in return, he was hit with the force of a battering ram. His body shook and trembled beneath the might and his bones felt like they would shatter at any moment. Had they been on land, this blow would have certainly done at least that, if not much more. This creature weighed tens of thousands of kilograms, and for some reason, it wanted to use his body as a toothpick. The storm had already made Silas feel so insignificant and small, but this whale. It was like the period at the end of the paragraph, the last word at the end of a story. This was the gap between humans and the true predators of Earth. He had just been thinking today how far he had come, only to be smacked right back down to Earth hours later. However, it was in that darkness that Silas' green eyes blazed. The stormy, turbulent waters seemed to be the only points of light. The angle of the sperm whale's headbutt sent him flying upward on an incline, just like he had calculated. He borrowed the momentum and soared up higher through the waters, instantly appearing meters from the surface. With the formation of another less than solidify greater than, he rushed through the rest of the distance. He had barely landed on the surface when he felt the danger signs hit him all at once. Blaring warnings came as the maw of the sperm whale opened up beneath him. The waters churned and a strong suction force was formed. Silas could only leap upward again with all his strength, but the sperm whale was hot on his trail, and it could jump far higher than he could. The creature's tail whipped and it soared out of the water, a menacing glint in its eyes. Silas was right in between its teeth. With a single chomp, he would be finished. There was no doubt that with its physical, it would tear right through him even if he was fused with the Basilisk King, let alone now. However, Silas was still in an unprecedented state of calm. He had faced off against an army of Arctic King Cobras, stared down the barrel of the maw of an Arctic Emperor Cobra. What was this little sperm whale compared to that? Just as the teeth were about to bite Silas in half, his gaze flashed with a deathly blue light. Less than Arctic howl greater than. Your understanding of less than Arctic howlers deepened. Less than Arctic howlers reached common mastery. Your understanding of less than Arctic howlers deepened. Less than Arctic howlers reached bronze mastery. Your understanding of less than Arctic howlers deepened. Less than Arctic howlers reached silver mastery. Arctic howl, FF, skill. Defense, 550. Attribute, ice poison. A roar left Silas' lips and an echo of blue fluttering runes jetted out from him in all directions. The timing was perfect. Just as the sperm whale bit down, its teeth crashed against the violently expanding barrier. Astral Howl had high defense for a mere FF skill. It was almost triple as effective as the legendary Mastery less than Solidify despite only being one grade above. But that was because it had a drawback. It was an instantaneous burst skill that only allowed a brief instant of defense. But in Silas' hands, he would always get the perfect timing. Plus, thanks to the Arctic Emperor Cobra's venom sac, he was able to raise its mastery so quickly. It would become an invaluable piece to his survival. The teeth of the sperm whale shattered against the barrier and a vicious ice poison ether began to spread through its maw. Silas raised up 2 hands, and though they were blades, they were still falling down toward the stomach of the pained sperm whale. Less than chilling scythe, greater than. One of his hands swung down with a vicious momentum, activating basic etherflow at the same time and bolstering the skill. He drove the blue scythe right down the throat of the sperm whale and into its most vulnerable inner organs. Ice and poison began to rot the creature from the inside out as Silas fell into its mouth.